Hello, listeners. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series with world-leading cult expert Dr. Alexandra Stein. In this second segment, Alexandra breaks down why certain terminology in the space of cult education is used and why it shouldn't always be avoided. Part 3 will focus on Alexandra's charity work and what she is currently focused on with her life's work. For early access to ad-free full-length episodes, please visit patreon.com/the Cult Vault to support the show from as little as £1 a month. But for now, here is Dr. Alexandra Stein. Do you feel that the area of, well, I suppose I should start by saying that I use the word cults, but I think what I'm starting to mean is cults and coercive control. I feel like they blur a lot of the time. I think sometimes I'm talking about them as if they're one and the same, when I know that there's elements that don't. There's coercive control in cults, and there's also coercive control in a lot of other areas in social hierarchies and jobs and all sorts of different places. Do you feel like the fundamentals of coercive control, do they stay the same, or do they shift as we shift with technology, with access to things like the internet, or do you think that it's primarily the same as it's always been in terms of manipulation and control over another person?
I think our understanding shifts and has shifted a lot and continues to as we understand this phenomena. The way I look at it is cults are a particular social structure. You know, they're this isolating hierarchical structure which are kind of shored up by an isolating ideology that supports the leadership. And then that ideology and structure sort of work to use processes of coercive control, which are, again, isolating, fear-based, alternating between, again, I'm going to quote Zablocki, assault and leniency, or as in the title of my book, terror and love. You kind of need both those things going in an unpredictable manner. So that's the coercive control piece. But in a cult, it's happening in a kind of institutionalized way within a group, although sometimes it can be one-to-one, but then as you said, coercive control also happens in other contexts that you wouldn't necessarily call a cult, like a family, although there are also family cults. So, there are some, where you draw these lines is interesting. But I think these are very basic human dynamics that are at work. The form of how this process of coercive control impinges on people changes with technology. So now we can do it via the internet as opposed to, maybe we did it face-to-face in real life before. But the fundamental, it's a biological, I believe it to be a physiological process of arousing fear in people in a very particular way, in a situation where they're isolated, again, where they can't really get away from the fear stimulus, and which results in, as attachment theorists call it, fright without solution. So you're trapped in this chronic relational trauma of being in this frightening relationship that you can't really get away from because you're isolated. And I think that works on very basic human processes that I suspect have gotten worse or get worse in times of fragmentation and crisis, because in those times, people's usual support structures for living aren't there or are in transition. So, our communities are much weaker than perhaps they used to be. We don't, like the famous book Bowling Alone, that was, I think, from the 90s. We don't join clubs so much anymore in real life. We don't join unions as much, though God knows we need to. The pubs are closing down in the UK. We don't, in London, we don't hardly know our neighbors, although in the pandemic, that was an interesting effect, that people did have to be more local and have to get to know the neighbors more. But, we don't have these coherent social structures in which we can operate with some kinds of safety nets and protection from life's difficulties. And that's the vulnerability. That's where the cults come in and say, oh, we've got a help center, we're going to help you, or we're going to make the world a better place. Or I'm not sure where I started that riff, but
I could just listen to you talk all day. You are so informed, and it's incredible just to hear you speak about things. Like it's like your years of work in the field. Obviously, just this stuff just comes so naturally and quickly to you whenever I ask a really confusing and complicated question. So I could just hear you talk about it all day.
Well, I just call it me rabbiting on, so thank you.
I love that. Rabbit on, please. So, terror, love, and brainwashing, attachment in cults and totalitarian systems. Can you talk us through what the main themes are of the book? I think we've probably touched on a few of them. Is there like a specific structure that you decided to use, or how have you broken the book up?
Well, so I first did a Ph.D. where I used attachment theory, which is really the heart of the book, is attachment theory, but not as normally used, I think, by a lot of kind of psychologists, because I'm using it in the context of groups and people's attachment to groups. So that was kind of a new way of looking at using attachment theory. In my PhD research, I did a comparative study between a political cult, this New York-based Newman tendency, and I compared it with the US Green Party, and as a not cult. That was kind of comparing a cult with a not cult. And I did a what I call the group attachment interview, where I used very tried and tested methods in psychology, but translated them to people's relationship to a group as opposed to an individual. And what I came up with was that 11 of my 12 cult subjects had what is called a disorganized attachment to their cult. Now, these were ex-members. They were all ex-members, both of the Greens and of the cult. So it was about them thinking about their relationships to the group retrospectively. So what that means is the cult people still had a kind of fearful and confused, not because they were stupid, by the way, they were not, none of these people were stupid, they were very intelligent, but they were still confused because of the fear they still held about that experience. And of my green, not cult people, none of them showed that. They all had what we call a coherent narrative of their experience, whereas the cult people had what we call incoherent, and incoherent in a particular way, where they would show basically dissociation at certain points in their narratives. They would just kind of go off in some way, because they would get absorbed back into a trauma memory, is what it is. So it was fascinating. So my hypothesis was that people in cults or totalitarian states, because I just see those as large cults, form a disorganized attachment to the group, which means the figure or the group to whom you're attached is presenting themselves both as the place of safety, but they're also the source of fear. And that creates a disorganized attachment. So you don't know whether to approach for comfort or to avoid because it's a fearful stimulus. So you have that creates confusion and indeed dissociation. And in that dissociation, I'll just carry on here for a bit, two things happen. Well, in that relationship, two things happen. One is if they're isolated, the person keeps seeking this frightening but supposedly comforting place in order to calm themselves, but they can't get calmed. So it's a positive feedback loop where they keep clinging on. And that's part of what makes it hard for people to leave, because they don't have a feeling, because it's not really a cognitive process, it's an emotional one. They don't have a feeling that there's any other place to get comfort because they've been isolated. So guru so-and-so is the only, or the group so-and-so is the only place. This is totally not conscious, by the way. This is just, again, somewhat physiological. But when you're approaching the source of fear, that makes you dissociate because it's crazy making. You shouldn't be going towards fear. And in the dissociation where you can't think about your relationship to the group can then pour in their crazy talk. So they tell you what you're feeling because you're dissociated. You can't think yourself what's going on. You're confused. So they can pour in this nonsense like that there are aliens jumping out of volcanoes and inhabiting you, or whatever it is. You know, each cult has its own marvelous, what Hannah Arendt calls fiction. It's like the QAnon stuff, you know, Hillary Clinton is a pedophile, et cetera, you know. These are just fictions. There's zero evidence. But in a frightened and confused person, it becomes the narrative by which they can explain their own fear, their own feelings, and, you know, whatever's going on in the world. So that's sort of a bit the heart of the sort of theoretical stuff in the book. But then so after I did my PhD, I wanted to broaden this into something that was readable, because PhDs aren't really readable, and to generalize it to all these different kinds of cults and cultic structures and states, so that people could see that this dynamic happens in all these different kind of situations. So I wrote the book. I did a chapter each for my 5-point definition of a cult. And then I used loads and loads of examples, you know, ranging from Scientology, you know, to the Moonies, to my cult, to North Korea, to Nazi Germany, et cetera, just loads of examples. And each chapter I would kind of make this theoretical point and then show how it happened in all these different situations. So that's kind of the heart of the book. And then, so I talk about the leadership, I talk about the structure is a chapter, ideology is a chapter, the process of brainwashing, aka coercive control, is a chapter, the results of this, and then I can't remember all the other chapters, but, you know, I go a bit into recovery and what we need to do as a society and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a summary.
That sounds absolutely incredible. When you were doing your PhD and you were comparing the two groups, did you have to quantify or provide evidence as to why they were and were not cultic environments?
I did. How did I do that? I think I'm trying to remember. It's a long time ago now. I used both qualitative and quantitative, but so the qualitative, I just used my 5-point definition and went through each thing and said, do they do this or not? And that was pretty clear. I used the GPA, the Group Psychological Abuse Scale from Langoni and somebody else. And I used something else, which I can't quite remember. Anyway, so it was a multiple method study. I used a lot of different methods. which I can encourage people doing PhDs on this topic to do, because, we're talking kind of whole worlds when we talk about cults. So it's really useful to look at them in the round if you have the flexibility in your program. And I looked at people's social networks. That was fascinating as well. So I tried to sort of quantify, well, I did quantify, before they joined the cult. So these were all people who were recruited. There were no born-ins. I looked at what were their social networks like before they joined, how many close friends did they have, that kind of thing. Then when they were in the group, who they were in contact with, and then after they left, what their networks looked like. And that was kind of obvious now, but it was very clear again. So, they had very similar networks before they joined. The same, I think it was about 3.2 close friends or something, and they each had more or less the same. Then they joined the group. The green people, there was not much change. They maybe added a friend or two. The cult people, that was just weird what happened. They, of course, lost all their previous friends. And I had quotes in the book about, I'd say to people, well, how many close friends do you think you had while you were in the cult? And they would say, well, I had a lot, maybe about 500. It was like, I don't think they're close friends. So the whole idea of what a friend was weird. When they got out of the cult, the Greens had their old friends and a couple new friends, whereas the cult folks lost all their cult friends, and they sort of were very lonely, right? It took them a long time to rebuild their social networks, which, of course, anyone who's been in a cult knows this. Anyway, well, if you're, for people who are interested, my dissertation is available to read on my website, but, I only recommend it for the academic-minded.
I'll put a link to your website as well in the episode description. That definitely sounds like something that I would love to read. So can you give myself and the listeners your 5-point definition of what is a cult, or what makes up a cult?
Well, and it's one of many. I think before you started recording, we were talking about the different scholars in this area, and we all have slightly different versions, but I think they're very much merge. I think we're all looking at the same elephant, and we're all, so I don't want people to think this is the be all and end all. It's one of the ones you can use, but the leadership is charismatic and authoritarian. And I think most cults are pretty much always started by one person. But once you get like the Jehovah's Witnesses and some of these other ones that have had a few generations, that gets lost, and you get more of an institutionalized kind of governing body, as they're called. But they still hold those characteristics, I think, we're the good people, but we're also going to bully you. It's, again, that terror love thing. So it comes from the leadership. It starts with that person who has the personality of having that psychopathic quality of, I'm charming and I'm ruthless. So that's the leadership. The structure is isolating, steeply hierarchical, closed once you're in the inner circle. Bigger groups will have front groups that are more the public face. But once you're in, it's quite closed and it has layers of secrecy. Then the ideology shores that up. So it's all comes from the leader. They're the ones who have the first and last say about what the belief system is. The ideology itself is isolating because it's this kind of black and white thinking, and you're either, there's no gray areas. It's fictional, the ideology. It's not connected to reality. There's many other things to say about the ideology, but the main thing is it exists to support that structure, that isolating, hierarchical, totally leader-controlled structure. Then the process, number 4 of the 5-point definition, is that of coercive control, which can also be called brainwashing or thought reform or mind control, whatever words you want to use. But it's that process that we've discussed of isolating and making fearful and so forth. And then the outcome of that, if you can create that situation with all those attributes, is you can have controllable, exploitable, deployable followers who will do what you say regardless of their own survival needs. So that's the short form, my 5-point definition.
That's amazing. And we, before we hit the record button, we did say that there are different models available from different experts in the field. But as you said, everybody's studying the same thing. So it's almost like you can take parts from each model to get a complete picture. And I think that that's wonderful. And something else that we talked about before we hit the record button is how difficult it is to navigate survivor spaces sometimes. There's obviously there's a lot going on within the spaces with individuals' recovery, group recovery, individuals' approach to how you should expose a group, or how you should talk publicly about a group. And there's all of these things going on that you don't really anticipate until you begin working in the space. It's only when you start to realize that there's a common goal in the field, and that is the recovery of individuals through education and activism. And it's only when you get to that point where you realize that that is the overall goal. If you're working with people that have that same goal, then it's so easy to do the work, and it feels great.
There's another goal that I think we share, by the way, which is really important, which is prevention. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that is such a great way to go into the next segment.
It's really important to me. I don't like to get it forgotten.
Absolutely. And I think that, as we said before we hit the record button, you have a model which you've just explained. Lots more detail, I think, that goes into that, which people can read in Terror, Love and Brainwashing. But then there's also models from Stephen Hassan, who we mentioned. He has the BITE model. I know that Jan Jelic has a bounded choice model. And there's Robert J. Lifton's criterion, which everybody references because it's kind of almost like one of the first.
Well, yeah, I mean,
things.
Yeah, the way, well, I have. You're making me want to say a lot of things here, which is a sign of a good interviewer. But first of all, I want to say it's not just those of us with doctorates. There are so many people, who don't get the acclaim because perhaps they haven't published, but they've been working for years and years and years. And I'm going to name one of them, or maybe two, from my experience just in Minnesota. And there's only to pick them, but just because of my personal experience. I mean, there's hundreds of people working really hard on this. But, when I came out and there was a support group and a chap called Doug Augustin and then a woman who called Heather Svoboda were working in this, just helping people, as we still do in Family Survival Trust, recover as volunteers. And there's so many people like that who are just wonderful. I wouldn't be where I am today, as they say, without Doug and Heather. I just wouldn't. So I just want to, to give a shout out to the people who don't get, whatever tiny bit of glamour this is. I don't know if it's that glamorous, but anyway. Then just in terms of the different models, the way I see it is that there's been these generations of scholars, and each one builds on the shoulders of those who come before. So, I tend to start this with the post-war, mostly German, mostly Jewish refugees, not all. People like Hannah Arendt, people, I think I'd include Erich Fromm in that, famously Stanley Milgram, Solomon Asch, Sheriff, Mosevere Sheriff, and I think it was his wife. There were these sociologists, psychologists, social psychologists, Arendt's a political theorist, who looked at that experience of Hitler's Germany and in some cases Stalin's Russia and tried to make sense of it. And they did fantastic work, a lot of which has gotten a bit forgotten. And then came Lifton and also Margaret Singer and also Edgar Schein, who went and did that research with the prisoners of war and camps and re-education camps in North Korea and China. And they took it in a slightly different direction, but really usefully. And by the way, there are also people writing literature doing this, like Arthur Koestler, and Doris Lessing, and, all these, George Orwell, there's such a rich background to what we do. Anyway, after Lifton, then came what I think of as my generation. So Steve, and then Yanya, and then myself, and Dan Shaw, and I'm sure I'm forgetting other people, and I'm sorry if I am. And now we're seeing another generation start to come up who I think mostly are the voices of those born and raised. And they are now speaking out and able to use our work, and as we've used work before. So that's how scholarship builds. And I just love that. And, by the way, my advisor, who helped me think about this, taught about the sociology of knowledge, that knowledge doesn't just spring fully formed from one person's brain, it's part of the human development of knowledge. Anyway, so, and then in terms of the different models, the way I see it, Steve has given us really useful stuff with the bite model of this kind of detail of how each of, the behavior and the information, the thought and the emotion, with all these nice detailed pieces of how those are each controlled. Yanya with her bounded choice model, which is I think mine and her models are overlap quite a lot. And the concept of the self-sealing system and this, as you said, the bounded choice. Dan Shaw really helps us understand how the leader operates, which I didn't really want to go into in my work, so I'm so grateful that, other people do these other bits, because I didn't want to think about the leader really. I mean, I did have to, but he really goes into that and into their heads, the ugly place that their heads are. So all of our work kind of supports each other. And, I would like us to have a more collaborative approach to these things. And unfortunately, academia often tries to get you to compete with other people, which is really not helpful. Let's collaborate and work together on, which we do. I mean, these folks I mentioned, we do, but we need more of that. So
yeah. It's amazing what you've just said there, because I remember my conversation with Dan Shaw when he said, what just happened to me? He resurfaced after spending all of these years in a group, and he said, what just happened to me? And he had to understand what happened to him in the same way that you did. And your journeys have kind of landed you in similar places, but also with very different work. And that is, again, a really interesting thing for me to think about in my own mind. You both had the same question, and the different ways in which you approached finding the answer to that, and the different resources that you've created for others along that journey is really interesting for me to think about. And you use the term brainwashing in the title of your book, and you've mentioned that there are alternative words or phrases that people might choose to use instead of the term brainwashing. I found myself not using that term because I haven't been told explicitly, but I've sensed through conversations that it's either not a word that's commonly used, or it's got perhaps derogatory connotations to it now. It feels almost taboo in some situations to use that word. Do you know why that is?
Yes, it's because people with a different agenda have tried to airbrush it out of history. It's very simple. You said it wasn't commonly used. Well, that's the opposite. I'm not saying I don't mean to be personal about it, but it actually is the most commonly used word among lay people. I mean, if you say thought reform to somebody, they don't know what you're talking about. But if you say brainwashing, they kind of have a clue, because that's the word in popular language. And why don't we use the words that people understand? This is where George Orwell has something to say to us. Let's talk in plain English. And it doesn't mean that everyone who uses that word has a perfect understanding, using all of these wonderful models. But they kind of know it's something that, by the way, is derogatory. Nobody thinks brainwashing is a good idea. It's a bad idea. I don't think people think cults are a good idea. I think, generally speaking, they think they're bad because they brainwash people. So I'm just in favor of using English. I mean, I've just been asked to write a chapter in a book, an academic book, I won't name names, where how they asked me was in this academic language that was so obtuse that I could not understand what it was about. And I had to sit down with a friend for about 3 hours to try to unpick this one paragraph, because they don't speak English anymore. And I just think it's elitist and it is horrible. And I don't want to ever write like that. So that's one part, is that I want to use words that people understand. And then the other thing where I started out is that there has been a very clear campaign to take away our language tools for discussing this issue by these people who we refer to in our field as cult apologists. And they have been very powerful in the field. And in academia, they used to block our publications. Now, I'm happy to say they're not so powerful anymore, partly because history has really overtaken them. Because, starting with ISIS, if people remember back, the terrible things of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all that, we've kind of slightly forgotten about them now. Now we're worrying more about the far right cults like Trump cult and QAnon. But, the things that the cult apologists have to say, which is basically there's no such thing as a cult, there's no such thing as brainwashing, people just make mistakes. And then they, try to blame it on these poor little new religious movements, as they call them. It just doesn't hold water in this day and age. There's too much of this around us. There's a reason we're seeing all these Netflix and, all these stories coming out, all these memoirs, which, by the way, is another part of I won't call it scholarship, but it's part of the literature that's really important, that people are telling their stories. And these stories are the true lived experience and true narratives about what happens in these groups, as opposed to the fictional narratives of these groups, which is, they're all wonderful and lovely. And then you get people telling these stories of, no, the leader raped me for 10 years. These are really important documents. Now, the apologists call these documents, and I'm going to name David Bromley as one of them, as atrocity tales told by angry apostates. Well, I'm not a violent person, but that makes me feel violent. It's like, how dare you say that to someone who's been abused for sometimes decades from your academic, ivory tower? How dare you say that to people? Yeah, I believe he said it to me in person once, so I'm particularly angry. But that's this group of people who are, some of whom have infiltrated the cult awareness field deliberately, and we have documentation on this. This is not a conspiracy theory. But their agenda is not the same as ours. They're not interested in prevention or recovery. They are interested in silencing us and muddying these concepts. And that's why they don't want us to use these words that people understand. They want to say these are new religious movements. Well, mine wasn't. Mine was a political group, had no religion whatsoever involved. Multi-level marketing schemes are not religious. I mean, some of them are actually.
I was thinking about. I mean, I think with multi-level marketing, just to kind of go off on the side a little bit, is a little bit of that kind of front-facing to the inner circle thing that you mentioned before. It's almost like a public-facing group that's still extremely abusive and exploitative of individuals, but then also acts as a recruitment tool for people into church environments and vice versa as well, I think. So they kind of bolster each other in this really nasty way. But I feel almost relieved that there's an explanation as to why certain terminology has been deemed by some groups or some academics in different areas as inappropriate, because brainwashing is, of course, the most simplistic word to use when you are trying to discuss a person that was one way one week and then completely different the next or the next following months or years. And it's almost a relief to finally kind of be like, I'm going to use that word now. I think now that there's an explanation, and I realize that it's not going to cause any upset or offense to individuals whose stories are being told on the show. That's the most important thing, I think. And I thought that I was going to be potentially upsetting people who were telling their stories by using that language. So it has been effective in stopping people from using certain terms, as you've said.
I mean, I should say that it does upset some people. Like, some people prefer the term high control group. And that's my second preference of what, because, it's got nothing to do with religion and it is descriptive of the control. But I wouldn't say, I mean, I do think some people, even who've been in cults or have been brainwashed, may not feel comfortable with those terms. I think you do have to kind of respect each individual. Because it is a heavy thing to say, I've been in a cult or I've been brainwashed. It's you don't earn a lot of points, for being a clever person. So I just want to say that, that I'm speaking in a kind of general way about talking about these things, and explain the politics behind it. The other argument that gets used a lot is cult is a derogatory term. And again, I kind of always reply, and I think even some of my close colleagues would say that. And I want to say, well, where's the where's the nice cult? Please show me one. Because other than when you're using cult in a completely different context, like the cult of the Beatles or something, which people know that's a completely different context. The person on the street knows the difference depending on the context. So it is a derogatory term. I do feel derogatory, if that's a phrase, about cults. I think they're terrible, and I think we should deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
As the chair of the charity I work with calls them, he says they're just criminal organizations. And I agree. I think that's as good a definition as anything. But they're criminal in a specific way where they use coercive control.
And I think I don't tend to use the term that much on the show, but I think that is also out of respect for some guests who don't use that word. But also for litigious reasons, I don't personally give that title to a group, whether I feel they are or not. That's not for me to say. If the guest wants to say that about their own lived experiences, then absolutely, of course, owning that and understanding that and putting definitions to experiences can be very empowering for an individual. So I always make the point not to say that myself. But it's not because I don't think that it's the right word to use.
And it
But
shows how cults are also trying to control the language, because a lot of the ones who are going to sue one, and I've been threatened, I think all of us have been threatened at one time or another, have often vast resources. And, being an expert in cult world does not involve gaining vast resources. I can testify to that. If you want to get rich, find another area.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series with Dr. Alexandra Stein. For more information on Alexandra's work, please follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.